Welcome to Origin Seminar. Today we have Brittany Miles. Brittany is 51 PEG-B Fellow and also University Presidential Fellow at University of Arizona. So Brittany did PhD at Santa Cruz, and then also work on the brown dwarfs, and very interested in the infrared spectroscopy and infrared ground-based especially, and we'll hear about some of her work characterizing brown dwarfs and directly imaged exoplanets in mid-infrared today. Really, take away.
Thank you for the intro. Since I am local, I did just put an about me slide because I'm not sure if I've seen everyone in the room. I got a pretty good intro. So I am a postdoc here. I started in October. And I completed my PhD at UC Santa Cruz with Andy Skimmer for more observational work and Phil Hims for some of my detector characterization work. And both of them went to U of A, both of them got their PhDs here. And I mainly care about mid-infrared spectroscopy and also instrumentation to better characterize brown dwarfs and directly image exoplanets. Okay. So this is just an image of the HR 8799 planetary system. It's kind of like the stereotypical image people think of when you ask them what's a directly imaged planet. You have these four self-luminous gas giants here, and direct imaging lets us actually directly detect that light that the light, which is just the leftover heat from formation for these objects. And just for context, this is the size of Neptune's orbit. So just placed into context, most of the planets we can directly image from the ground now are typically very far out planets, and they have very little interference in their SCD from the light of the host star. Or I should say they have low contribution to their SCD from the host star. It's still hard to take images because of the host star. And to date, most of the planets we can actually take direct images of are fairly warm objects. So like the coldest directly imaged exoplanet we've detected is about 600 Kelvin. And through indirect methods, we know that smaller and colder objects exist. And so we need to put an effort to figure out what are the best instrument modes to characterize their atmospheres? What do we need to do to go from these Jupiter-like objects to colder things? Or massive Jupiter-like things to colder things. So most of my research revolves around using brown dwarfs as analogs to directly imaged exoplanets. So both brown dwarfs and gas giant exoplanets are primarily hydrogen gas balls. They have their heat from formation, and they collapse and contract over time. And so this is a color magnitude diagram. On the y-axis is just the absolute J-band magnitude, which is a proxy for effective temperature. And on the x-axis is just colors. And so, okay. These brown dots are photometric points from brown dwarfs, and then the blue dots are just some photometric points from directly imaged exoplanets. Okay. And again, like I mentioned, brown dwarfs are significantly easier because you're not trying to get to a really low contrast to observe the host star. They're typically isolated, so they're accessible to long slit spectroscopy and things like that. And here I'm just plotting the sequence of brown dwarfs here. And what you'll notice is that even though some directly imaged exoplanets may have odd colors, for every single directly imaged exoplanet, there is a similar effective temperature brown dwarf you can possibly study to understand, what's the dominant molecular feature at a given wavelength range? What kind of clouds should you expect to condense in the atmosphere of these planets? And as you'll notice that there is this kind of desert here where there aren't any directly imaged planets just yet, but there are Y dwarfs that are occupying this temperature range, which may be accessible from longer exposure time studies or stuff we can observe with the GMT. And I just want to remind people that, brown dwarfs are inherently interesting in themselves. We're going from 2000 Kelvin all the way to 300 Kelvin. you go from things that are carbon monoxide dominated to methane, they have ammonia in the atmospheres. So there's such a large diversity of chemistry and physics you would expect to see just in this effective temperature range. So now I'm going to motivate why I care about the mid-infrared, particularly like 3 to 5 microns for characterizing these objects. So one, for brown dwarfs that are typically below 600 Kelvin, they emit most of their light between 3 to 5 microns. So in terms of contrast, you may want to move to this wavelength regime for detection. And two, if you're trying to measure absorption features, you need to measure the absorption against something. So there's some SED to do that. And in this plot, Caroline Morley plotted opacity versus wavelength across about 3.5 microns to 5.2 microns. And where there's a peak in opacity, there should be a depth in the spectrum. So from 4 to 5 microns, water's the dominant absorber, 3 to 4, the dominant absorber should be methane. And if you're using something like a retrieval or something, you can maybe look at these more like lower abundance species like hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and also measure maybe some things that should be there, assuming that there's disequilibrium chemistry going on. So in addition to water, methane, this is something you wouldn't see from the ground because the Earth's atmosphere blocks out a lot of light, but CO2 is something we can see from JWST, carbon monoxide here, this is deuterated methane, acetylene, I believe, and then hydrogen cyanide as well. And so on the bottom plot, these are also these. So yeah, both phosphine and germane have been detected in Saturn and Jupiter, and they're only there because there's hot gas being brought up to the upper atmosphere. But they theoretically should be in brown dwarfs, but haven't been detected just yet. So with JWST, you can access where phosphine and maybe germane, you'll have the signal to noise and wavelength coverage to access these molecules. So now I'm just going to talk about what is some of the observational work I've been doing. So I've been focusing on the L to T transition where brown dwarfs typically go from these really red colors to bluer colors. And so this is where there are these silicate clouds in the atmosphere and they sink below. And because these clouds fall deeper in the atmosphere, they have these bluer colors once you go from the L to T region here. This portion is also significant because this is where the dominant carbon-bearing gas transitions from carbon monoxide also to methane here. So the two projects I'll talk about are my L-band, which is 3 to 4 microns, spectroscopy studies of these two objects, PSO 318.5 and VHS 1286b. They're two fairly isolated brown dwarfs that are really red here and occupy this region. We had to go to L-band to find methane, where we couldn't previously see it in the near infrared. And then I'll talk about some of the JWST Early Release Science spectra of VHS 1286b. And then lastly, I'll talk about this region here where Y dwarfs exist, where there are no directly imaged planets right now. So this will tell us what does the future hold for what kind of atmospheric chemistry we'll see in these planets. And then I'll talk about how CO, even though these objects are super cool, we see CO, which is due to disequilibrium chemistry in the atmospheres. Okay, nice. So I'm going to repeatedly show color magnitude diagrams. So here's another one. This is the same color magnitude diagram showing L dwarfs here colored in blue, when T dwarfs here colored in green as these squares or diamonds. So these objects are carbon monoxide dominated and these are methane dominated. So these two objects, VHS 1286b and PSO 318.5, they appear here and here on the color magnitude diagram. And also on these white triangles, I have the photometric colors of the HR 8799 planets. So both of these objects are color analogs to that directly imaged system I showed at the beginning of the talk. And because they're fairly isolated or Y companions, they're really accessible to long slit spectroscopy from the ground. And so both of these objects have colors that put them square in the region where you expect to see methane. But if you look at the near-infrared spectra, there is no methane feature at 1.6 micron for both of these objects. And in fact, they have K-band CO absorption here and here, as if they were warmer brown dwarfs. And so there's been some, I mean, it's obvious now with JWST, but back then people were trying to figure out, if these objects are so cold, why does this chemistry look like that? So the reason we went to the L band is because that is where methane has its highest relative opacity. So if you don't see it there, it's actually missing, not just less abundant. So that's what I did with this Keck project. And I had to spend
I'm not working with field, so can you explain a bit more why the brown dwarfs on the upper part would have a CO dominated and the other one would have a methane dominated? What is actually changing the chemistry? I mean, the temperature is not such that you would expect condensation, so what's happening?
So to my understanding is just, so at a given pressure and temperature, so there's a reaction chain between CO and methane, and depending on the pressure and temperature, the reaction is more likely to happen one way or the other. So just by going to a cooler temperature is more likely to trend towards methane than CO. The other issue is pressure, and that's related to gravity as well. And so if there's lower gravity, there's convection, and it's more likely to bring up hot gas to the top too.
Maybe there, but not visible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's that's a good question though. So I spent an entire night just on 2 objects. So just observationally, we have to do AB nodding along the slit. Every hour or two, I do calibrator, science target, calibrator, science target, calibrator, because that's how bad the telurks are in the mid-infrared from the ground. I did this reduction with my own custom pipeline, and these are the spectra and the error bars plotted. So the spectra are in color and the error bars are in black. And on the top, I have the opacity of methane. So where there's a peak, there's a dip here. And so you can see these very slight methane features in both VHS 12.6b and PSO through 8.5. So these objects were never missing methane, they just had a lower abundance of it. And I'm gonna just visually, so you can see why this is weird, I'm gonna plot some normal looking brown dwarfs. So these are L5s to T5s. This is 1700 Kelvin. This is 1000 Kelvin. Both of these objects are 1200 Kelvin. If it's 1200 Kelvin, the methane feature should be this really huge wide feature here, but these are very slight features. So that tells us that, there's this really hot gas is being brought up to where the photosphere, or where we're measuring it with our spectra, and it's washing out these features with the CO dominated gas. And so I don't have the time to talk about all the details, but essentially with using atmospheric modeling, you can estimate how deep in the atmosphere you have to go to access that CO or methane abundance that you see at the top of the atmosphere. And you can measure this parameter called the eddy diffusion coefficient. It's called KZZ. A higher value of KZZ tells you the atmosphere is mixing very strong and accessing lower portions of the atmosphere. A low value tells you that it's not mixing a lot. And so with these initial estimates, we measured a KZZ of 10 to the 8, which tells us these atmospheres are mixing very strongly. So now, 5 years later, this project was proposed, I think, my second year in grad school. So this was 2017 or something, but we eventually got the data last summer. And VHS 12.6b was chosen as the ERS target to look at, how well does JWST do spectroscopy of planetary mass companions for a very easy case. So VHS 12.6b, I mentioned, is very far from its host star. So it's basically a point source in the IFU modes for MIRI and NIRSPEC. And the goal was to get 1 to 28 micron spectroscopy at resolutions of 1700 to 3000. People ask, why do we pick this target? Is because the GTO teams picked a lot of easy targets already. So this is kind of the leftover thing that's most planetary And we have a lot of ground-based data and to have a good benchmark for some base parameters for atmospheric modeling. So previously, I just wanted to put into context, like what's the best we've been able to do for brown dwarfs. So near-infrared spectroscopy is pretty standard. You can get 1 to 2 microns pretty easily from the ground. 3 to 5 microns, well, this is 3 to 4, but you can also get 3 to 5 microns pretty easily if you take the time. And then Spitzer did like an R of 10 from the mid-infrared out to 10 microns. And our JWST data is effectively doubling this wavelength coverage at signal to noises of like 50 to 100. So this is a JWST spectrum. Yeah, it looks very good. So to get this was very challenging. So the pipeline did not work out of the box. So I had to reduce so for NIRSPEC, I had to reduce every single filter grading mode, also reduce commissioning data for A-star to actually get the flux calibration right. And then for MIRI, MIRI worked better out of the box, but we just did standard spectral extraction. And my colleagues have some algorithms to get some of the fringing effects out of the spectrum too, so that's another step we had to do. And with no fudge factors, we got pretty good agreement between NIRSPEC and MIRI, so I'm really proud of that. And then there was spectra out past like 15 microns, but we really couldn't get that data really well, so we compiled it into a photometric point. So we have a 1 to 20 micron spectrum of a brown dwarf with pretty good signal to noise. And I'm going to talk about each of these features up close. So the first feature that the first feature that I wanted to look at were these sodium and potassium absorption lines in the spectra. So the VHS 1206B spectrum is in black here. These color spectra are template brown dwarfs. And these spectral features are really shallow compared to similar spectral type or temperature brown dwarfs. And so part of the reason these features are very shallow is because they're lower surface gravities. So that's one of the big, we've seen this from the ground, but this is nice to have it validated through JWST. From 1.3 microns to 1.6 microns, you can see pretty clear water absorption here. Water's absorption is something you can do at Hubble, but not necessarily at this resolution, and then getting water from the ground is really hard. There are some artifacts still in the spectrum. So the way the JWST spectrum converts detector images into IFU cubes, which we extract on, introduces some wobble effects, which I'm hoping there needs to be some iteration on to get this out of the data. But there is a slight absorption feature here, but it's hard to tell with the wobbles. From 1.8 to like 2 microns, you have more water absorption here. Again, because of the artifacts from NIRSPEC, you can't really see the CO feature as well, but you can see the, like, where the peak of CO absorption should be at like 2.3 microns. And then you have this really good water absorption feature here from like 2.4 to 3 microns. And I showed you a really scraggly ground-based spectrum. This is what you get with JWST. You get a very nice clean methane absorption feature and even see the dip at 3.3 microns. The spectrum is so good, you can also see the wings here where there are some peaks here in the opacity. And this is a really good methane absorption. Yeah.
So what's the real signal to noise here? And in other words, are all the features that we see there real? Like all the little,
yeah.
Because if it was the ground-based spectrum, it would be noise, right? But,
yeah.
So every little line there is real.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
I do think so. It's early release science. I do think more iterations need to be done on the spectrum to make sure all the wobbles are real, but we're talking about like a signal to noise of like 200 per. I mean, okay. Yeah. And
Yeah,
yeah,
it's really good. Oh my God.
this is my favorite feature. It's carbon monoxide. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Wow.
So it looks exactly like the opacity feature, just backwards. And you could probably write a whole paper about this. It just looks really amazing. Yeah.
But for the myriad other bumps and wiggles,
Yeah.
is there an equivalent opacity that you could put up there that would map with them, or is it not, is it not mapped out for the entire wavelength range?
It's not mapped out. So
Okay.
that's also a good question because we could not get an atmospheric model that fits all of the absorption features and matches the overall SED. So one of the challenges with this work is actually how do you get a model cloudy enough that doesn't wash out these absorption features? So that with the time constraints of the project, we couldn't get a good fit, but that is upcoming work that needs to happen to match all of the data.
But like, even without a model, like, can you say, oh, well, the model should contain some whatever molecule at 5.2 microns to reproduce? Is it like, are those molecules all identified, or are there unknown transitions that might be lurking in here?
That's a good, I don't think for like obvious models, I think you could say like, this is supposed to be there, but like for something that's one line, I'm not sure you can make that claim. But if there's a molecule specific, we can talk more about it.
Yeah, no, I don't have a specific, I don't have anything specific in mind. I'm just wondering to what extent it's,
Yeah,
already well known, but making a self-consistent model is the problem, or it's that you don't even know what the transitions are.
I got you. I think for like methane, CO, water, we know where they should be located and you know where it's at. If it's something that's a lot narrower and it hasn't been seen on a brown dwarf with other data, the referee didn't really like us claiming that something was there.
But I'm saying, like, if you have some, like, are there line lists that exist that plausibly cover all of these ranges?
Oh yeah, totally.
And it's not entirely presumably CO, methane, and
Yeah.
So there is the hydran data.
but not necessarily, but the hydrate doesn't necessarily go to every pressure and temperature that might be relevant. That's, I don't know for every molecule,
I
right?
think it does.
For the, okay, yeah,
I think
that's
it
what
does, but I think the challenge is really more fit,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there are so many lines.
No, I can say, yeah, I get it, yes, it's
Your model there shows isotope a lot. Is that C18? Do you see evidence of that in the spectrum?
I haven't done that. I know someone's looking into it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many spinoffs you can do from this spectrum alone, but I don't. Yeah. And then this is the MIRI spectrum, where you have mainly water absorption, some methane. This methane feature is relatively shallow. I'm learning comparing this to other brown dwarfs, and then some of this is due to water. The main feature here is this dip, which is due to silicate clouds in the atmosphere. I'll show some comparisons later, but the reason that is significant is because those red colors that HR 8799 planets have and some other low gravity brown dwarfs, these red colors they're probably due to clouds lingering in the atmosphere, but because we don't have a direct detection of a silicate feature, figuring out exactly what is causing that delay in those colors is hard to, there are some doubters, but this is definitive proof that there is some lingering cloud opacity in the atmosphere that contributes to some of the redness of the object. So that was a big deal in this paper. And so the data are plotted in gray in both panels, and then there's a template brown dwarf plotted in blue in both panels. And the blue object in this panel is relatively cloudless, and so there's just a straight line across where there's mainly just water and methane. And then this brown dwarf is relatively cloudy. And this is just showing that this is very likely a silicate absorption feature. Notice, so VHS-26b is a late L dwarf. This is a kind of a mid L dwarf. And so I'm wondering if there's something that's colder that's a more direct comparison. But I think future work needs to be done to actually model the specific silicate species that contributes to this opacity feature, and figure out like, how does this also map to the near infrared colors that we see as well? Okay, so the conclusions of this work, we already validated things. We know VHS 1252b is a very young, cloudy planetary mass companion with the atmosphere that's out of chemical equilibrium. JWST has the capability to characterize other brown dwarfs within the signal to noise range at good quality. I think this was only 7 hours for this whole thing, plus some overheads. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned here with other targets as well. And I'm gonna just take a pause just to take any questions so far before I transition to my other projects.
Yeah, you mentioned the wobbles a few times. I'm not too sure what you're referring to there. Can you explain that a bit more, please?
Yeah, so let's see. Oh, actually, I don't have to annotate, but it'd be nice. So this is a really nice K-band feature of carbon monoxide. There are no wobbles. It's like a fairly flat feature or pretty smooth. Even here, the data is not great, but you can still see like there are no significant like oscillating wobbles here. But with the JWST spectra, there's these beating patterns in some of the IFU cubes that we have. And I've done some other reductions. I'm pretty sure it's the way they do the interpolation between the detector images and the spectral cubes, but this feature is not present in all the reductions, and I'm not sure why it's there with the pipeline version we use. So that's what I mean, that I think it's oscillation, and I think it's a pipeline artifact.
So the lines are probably a bit more reliable than the continuum then? Is that a fair statement?
I think that's, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Why they only show up in that range of wavelength, or is you can find them all across the spectrum?
Wait, can you repeat that?
Why the oscillations are showing up only? This is like a systematic error in the interpolation.
Yeah.
Why they're showing up only in this narrow band and not all across the?
That's a good question. I don't know, but for the A star, which has a signal to noise of 1,000, it has oscillation at every mode of NIRSPEC. And so I'm not sure if it's a brightness thing or like how the pipeline handles targets, but I don't have a good answer for that. But I know for brighter objects, it's in every single mode. Yeah. So it may be in here, but just not at the same amplitude.
Let me go for the Arthur and then Ilaria.
Sure.
Arthur online, could you ask a question? Could you unmute?
Yeah, thanks, Brittany, so much. Like, this is such a cool, like, I just love this work. Like, it's the first, like, major L-dwarf, like, observation with JWST. So it's just, like, really cool. This is going to be a really cool benchmark. And even though, all the, like, modeling of the continuum and all the cloud species has yet to be done, I mean, that's just, really exciting work to be done. Can you remind me, is this the variable brown dwarf system?
Yes. Yeah.
So is there anything anything you found in this, or any assumptions you made, or stuff that you'd like to look at regarding that?
So we got lucky in that. So some of the ERS team has been tracking this object to, understand how variable it is on what timescales. And so all of our observations were in like a relatively low variability trough. And so we think our observations are unaffected by it, but this object is still pretty variable.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And
Awesome. Oh, go ahead, please.
Oh no, I just think it's another thing that will be very interesting to follow up on too. So it's just another reason this is a really exciting target.
Yeah, and it would be good to, I'm not sure how feasible it is. It'd be good to know how much of which features track with what variability.
Right.
Near infrared changes a lot, but with the mid infrared is theoretically predicted not to change too much with variability, but we need to know if that's true or not. And does that track with the cloud features? Because we think
Right.
clouds have variability.
Yeah, that was my first thought too, is if that silicate feature is variable, for example, would be very interesting.
Yeah, this is a small question. I was just curious. I know that the sodium line and resonance line of optical wavelengths. Why do you see only one there instead of two? With the potassium, you see two, which makes sense to me, but not for the sodium.
That's a good question. I'm actually not, so you're saying this should be a doublet?
Yeah, and optical wavelengths is double because of the splitting of the energy, and the same happens for the potassium. So I see the potassium here, and I don't see that infrared wavelengths, the sodium. So I was surprised.
Actually, I noticed that.
Yeah. So like maybe here?
I don't know.
Oh,
It may be.
I would expect this. There should be.
I'll have to check that out. It's so in Caitlin Allers has a paper where she lines out all these features in each brown dwarf, and these are only labeled as one and these L dwarf, but I'll double check to see if maybe it's something I missed. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is maybe a more general question. I mean, do you think that in the new JWST ground dwarf spectrum era, we finally need to go beyond 1D models for these atmospheres? I mean, some of the things you're saying make it seem clear that it is. If it's patchy clouds, you need a composite model to get the lines and the colors right. So
yeah,
are people like, do you have like ideas of how to do this, or?
So I'll talk a little bit about that later in my talk. I'm not sure about clouds. It was very ad hoc, like we just put two clouds because it worked, but there was no logic behind that. But I think, so Sagnik Mukherjee, who's at UCSC, has been doing one-dimensional mixing models. And so that one, at least for clouds, that 1D, so how fast the atmosphere mixes, it tells you what type of grains can settle out and things like that. So he's made a model that tells you how fast the atmosphere is mixing as a function of pressure. And so that's kind of like the next step to actually benchmark that, or at least try that against JWST data, understand how much mixing is there based on the molecular lines, and then based on the clouds that can settle out, does that match our data? So that is the next step we need to do. Yeah.
Okay, continue with this.
Okay. Okay. Okay, back to ground-based data, which don't look as good, but I love it. All right. So in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned how a lot of directly imaged exoplanets are relatively warm, but we want to understand what's the feature going to look like when we characterize these planets and take low resolution spectroscopy. So the answer to that is really late T dwarfs and Y dwarfs. So here I have a spectrum of YZOA55 plotted in black. YZOA55 is about 250 Kelvin. And the blue spectrum is Jupiter, which has an effective temperature of about 120 Kelvin or something like that. And even though these objects are like only 100 Kelvin apart, they have very different absorption features. So YZOA55 mainly only has absorption due to water across 4.5 to 5.2 microns. Excuse me. Jupiter, however, has absorption due to phosphine. It's a disequilibrium molecule, and also has water absorption. So even though these objects are really close in temperature, they look very different. So we want to understand, from this gap of where there are no spectroscopically characterized directly imaged exoplanets, what's the deciding factor on what molecular features appear? Is it effective temperature? Is it something else? This is more like just a look and see project. Okay, so this is my sample of objects. I picked, they either already have published N-band spectra, or I went and used Q-mode observations using Gemini GNIRS to get really low resolution N-band data. So the first object was Gliese 570D, like 2 mass 0415. And then the, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh yeah, so I took N-band spectroscopy of 4 new objects. My advisor took spectra of YZOA55, and then Jupiter we've been looking at since forever, and we have ESO data for that. So instead of spectral type, I wanted to use effective temperature because spectral types can mean different things, even though two objects can be the same spectral type, but look very different spectroscopically. So I took all of the photometry spectra available and got effective temperatures based on the models that we're actually using. So there's at least some attempt at uniformity between all these objects to put them in a sample.
So what model were you using for temperature?
The Sonora Bobcat models.
Okay.
Yeah. And I guess I don't say it, but this, it's hard doing in-band work. So it's only 4 objects, but this is 50 hours of Gemini time. Okay. So what is the observational setup we use? We use a really low resolution of, GNIRS, but because the data are so low so signal to noise, I bend that down to like an R of 100 or so. We got coverage from 4.6 to 5.1 microns, and we have to use really short exposures with a lot of coads to avoid nonlinearity on the detector. And again, I use the pattern where you take a calibrator, take the science, take the calibrator to flux or to at least get the continuum of the object. And observations are not executed until a certain air mass requirements are met, water vapor, or other conditions are met. If you take I've seen people take near-infrared spectra through a cloud on the ground, but you cannot do that in the mid-infrared at all. So yeah. So in order to execute the program, so most of these objects, I think, have a J-band magnitude of like 20 or more. And so typically we have to find a background star, a nearby star, and then acquire on that, and then offset to where we think the brown dwarf should be, and then integrate for like an hour or two. And then we'll find out if we missed or not. So there were originally 5 objects I took data or I wanted in the program, but only got 4. Okay.
So can I ask just like a really dumb but theorist question? So why is this so bad? Like, why are we so bad at knowing where things are?
So, okay, that's a good question.
As a theorist, I don't understand why this is like, where we have to like take a 2-hour observation to find if we pointed to the right place.
Okay. No, okay, so I didn't understand.
I didn't understand.
I mean, H-band especially, if you don't calibrate, you can't sometimes see very well.
Well, I understand that like the first time.
Yeah.
First time, but like once you know where things are, I would think we had better precision than that.
The telescope tracking well.
Yeah, so no, we don't have, it's like, what's the?
There's always pointing problems,
Mhm.
pieces, and if someone changes an instrument on another side of the telescope, the next program, it changes the weight balance and the pointing model is off, and so the telescope doesn't point exactly right. And the blind offset thing is very hard.
So the point is that if you're right, so you have to do a small correction at the start of your program for any star.
You
Mhm.
can see the
Right.
You tell the telescope 2 arc seconds in this direction. Something like 2 arc seconds, but it might be 2.1 or 2.2. And if you're doing a blind offset, then
Then
that's everything.
And our second is pretty much guys for moving a Python.
Yeah.
Wait, I had the same question too. I was like, why can't you just take a J-band image for me and then point again? But
That would be great. Take imaging before and then right away, you can actually get the target coordinate and then put slit on it.
but that's how JWST works. Isn't it? Like the acquisition is programmed into JWST observations and then.
But it's actually not, so we were told that it's very precise, so we didn't do acquisition, but it's actually not very precise.
Actually,
So you
yeah.
have to do acquisition for those of you.
Yeah.
In HST that happened, but when you do the very, very faint objects, a lot of times they weren't there.
Okay.
Look at the image first.
All right. So this is a plot showing, what did we expect to see when we submitted this program? Essentially, over the range from like 700 Kelvin down to 200 Kelvin, basically we only expected water to change because there's an effective temperature change. The slope of the object changes a bit. But sorry, someone's in. Oh.
So I can read for Ben. Most people don't realize just how small an arc second is. A telescope that can point 5 arc second over the entire sky is a mechanically miracle. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Okay, we just expected to see water changes and that's it, but that's totally not what happened. So this is what our collection of objects looks like. I have them plotted just from really hot to really cold. So Gliese 570d, all the way down to Jupiter.
They look good.
Yeah.
That's really hot to really cold. And we actually would feel really hot to really cold.
Yeah.
That's human temperature, not stellar temperature. That's currently.
Yeah. So, okay. So the one thing we should notice is that the little downward slope towards redder colors is not what we see for most of these objects here. Even Gliese 570d, it's like there's a peak here. This is like flat, and then this is doing its own thing. This is a really good CO. I mean, it was a good CO feature when I took the data, but this is a CO feature here, and it gets brighter at redder wavelengths. This one does too. This is WISE-Wave 55, and this is Jupiter with phosphine and water.
I don't understand how you have CO at 500.
Because there is convection in the atmosphere, and it brings up the warm gas to the photosphere. We're observing that, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay. So, we plotted equilibrium temperature to all these objects, and there's clearly mismatches across the spectrum, just to show that the equilibrium case does not work. The data are colored, the models are in gray circles here. Even WISE-Wave 55 is not modeled by equilibrium atmosphere. So the next step we did was add CO to each model until we got a better fit. So this is equilibrium, this is adding CO. So even though this is some scraggly M-band data, you can at least tell that you need a little bit of carbon monoxide to better fit the overall SCD at these wavelengths. And in addition to this, the warmer brown dwarfs require a lot more CO to match the overall slopes. And even though these colder brown dwarfs, they have CO, it's just not as much abundance-wise. And so, like I mentioned earlier, these CO is a hot gas. So that means something is upwelling it into the upper atmosphere. And so because we have CO, we can estimate eddy diffusion coefficient or KZZ value for each of these brown dwarfs. So these T dwarfs and Y dwarfs typically don't have near infrared spectra. So there's no signatures that tell you what the surface gravity is. So you have to estimate the atmospheric mixing, assuming different surface gravities. So for each of these brown dwarfs, I have the KZZ or atmospheric mixing value plotted with different values of surface gravity that's physically allowable for those objects. Jupiter has one data point because we know how massive Jupiter is. The surface gravity is not a mystery there. And then these dashed lines are the theoretical upper limit, assuming all of the heat of the object contributes to convection. So Jupiter and WISE-Wave 55, they are mixing near like their theoretical upper limits. These warmer brown dwarfs are mixing below those theoretical upper limits. And so more pointing facts. All of these objects in our sample, also, I didn't mention this, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this. So Jupiter also has CO absorption, which is evident in high resolution spectroscopy. So all of the objects in our sample have some evidence of disequilibrium chemistry with the CO as the marker in its atmosphere. And so we think, one theory as to why these hotter brown dwarfs don't mix as efficiently as the colder ones is because brown dwarfs are not like, they're not just one big convective cells. There are regions where something is primarily radiative or convective. So the the idea is that maybe there is some radiative zone that makes the convection a lot less efficient somewhere. And so that's why you have a lower CO abundance as if it was mixing near its theoretical upper limit. Now I'm going to talk about kind of what are the next steps. And this ties back to your question about like one-dimensional studies of these objects for mixing. So atmospheric mixing changes as a function of pressure and also varies along the radial direction in the atmosphere. So Sognick-McCarthy has developed self-consistent one-dimensional atmospheric mixing models that have been applied to the ground-based data that I published in 2020. And we applied for cycle 2 time to get a good benchmark set of objects to validate it against T-dwarfs, which don't have clouds. So it's kind of like the base case. And so this is just an example of an atmosphere. You have pressure, temperature, and this is a high gravity brown dwarf. And so it has the upper layers are radiative. It has some convective zones. This region is kind of where our spectra are sensitive to. And then these are the deeper layers that affect the chemistry up here. And there's irradiative and also convective zones here. So this is just an example of what may be the reality, not like this is the case. And so this is Sognick's updated models applied to my work, where the median of my data is plotted in this faded red line here. And using the self-consistent one-dimensional mixing models, these bold red points are the actual quench KZZ values you get if you do the full one-dimensional analysis for these objects. So using 1D comparisons, you still get the colder objects mix more, but you have a more realistic view of these hotter objects, and they may not mix as fast to get their CO abundances. And so I think we need to, at least for the next step, is to actually apply this to JWST data. So I have really low resolution spectra. One of the benefits of broader wavelength coverage and resolution is you get a better handle of the pressure temperature profile, and that better informs the models. So I'm looking forward to actually comparing these models to JWST data that we'll get in the next like year or so. So yeah, this is a summary of all my work. I'm kind of over time. PSO 318.5, VHS 12.6b do not show near-infrared methane because of strong mixing, but we detected at L-band. Late T-dwarfs and early Y-dwarfs, so CO absorption, even though they're cold due to atmospheric mixing. Colder brown dwarfs are likely to have more efficient mixing to bring that CO and gas up, even though they have overall lower abundances. And last point, atmospheric mixing is very common in the samples I did, and maybe we should plan for it and expect it with the Spectral we'll get with directly imaged exoplanets. And so thank you for listening to my talk, and that's all I have.
All right, more questions? Okay.
So what is quench KZZ in your previous plot? The quench is.
So the quench, okay, so let's see. The abundance of a given molecule is dependent on pressure and temperature. So theoretically, there's some point along this pressure temperature profile where that abundance value is met, and the atmosphere is mixing so much that that abundance at that point reflects in the upper atmosphere. So that KZZ you have to get to reflect that value is what that is, to my understanding.
I understand what KZZ is.
Yeah, I may be explaining it wrong.
No, that I get. And I understand what you just said. I guess the word quench means like support. Like I just don't understand what means in that. Like
it totally does. There's some time scale from conversion of methane to CO, and if that time scale is shorter, or if that time scale is longer than the time scale of mixing, that determines how deep that abundance is quenched.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, any other question? Okay, question, any online and Zoom audiences? No? Let me see. Okay,
I-
Daniel.
I have a question. Excellent talk, exciting results. So what's next in terms of the, for example, James Webb observations?
So for me or for what the TAC decided?
For the field, I think what would be the next big question where you see that the James Webb Spectral will help understanding really cool brown dwarfs? Mhm.
Okay, I think so. Phosphine, we didn't detect phosphine in any of my N-band spectra, and we haven't seen it to date with Akari or Spitzer. I think actually looking at, a wide range of brown dwarfs to understand, do we actually understand phosphorus chemistry in brown dwarfs, will be a meaningful question, along with like germane and other like non-carbon, non-oxygen molecules here. There's some work in the mid-infrared regarding like ammonia, and there's only a handful of like dedicated time for myriad observations of brown dwarfs, but I think understanding the ammonia abundances is a big step forward too for figuring out, assuming the best case scenario of all these molecules, how well can you measure the metallicity or overall abundances for these brown dwarfs? Because if we can't do it for a brown dwarf, I don't know what the deal is going to be for like other planets.
Okay, thank you. And I had another question in terms of the mixing. Do you think that large scale, so you obviously here speak about vertical mixing for the quenching and for the chemistry, microbial chemistry. Do you think that there's a connection to large scale mixing too? In terms of, would you expect, for example, correlation between disequilibrium, level of disequilibrium chemistry and the rate of rotational rotation period or velocity for the brown dwarfs?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that, but I think we should base that information on what we've seen with Jupiter and observations of that. Like, so, like essentially knocking down full disk observation of Jupiter to understand what we would see in a representative spectrum would be the first step I would take to understanding that.
That's a good point. So like a spectral comparison of the, say, polar regions where the rotation is less important to the equatorial regions where it's more important.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think Everett raised his hand before you did. Yeah, Everett.
Yeah, thanks for the excellent talk. I just loved that the brown dwarf spectrum is so beautiful and all the features. I was wondering if you could say anything about the dynamics, like the velocity. Is there any velocity information with the CO lines and the broadening of those lines?
I'm not sure. I have not looked into that. I'm not sure if we have the resolution for it.
It's too low. Okay.
Yeah. Or I think some papers I get the velocity, they're like tens of thousands, and this is like 3,000 or 1,700 or something like that. But I haven't checked myself.
Okay, thanks.
So actually that leads into my question, which is, you have the best brown dwarf spectrum ever taken. I think, and that's a fair statement. And looking ahead, do you think there's utility in, if we can figure out how to get the photons even higher spectral resolution, or are you able to probe at 5,000 resolution, whatever you're getting now, enough about the atmospheric chemistry to really understand this? Is there more to be, 10 years from now, if we could get 50,000? I don't know how, is that useful from a chemistry perspective, or is it not? Because you're already resolving CO2 lines.
Yeah. I think for isotopes, I think that's useful. I'm not sure how much, let's say you were to get R50,000 or even 100,000 on like 20 brown dwarfs, how much time would that take? But I think isotope information is valuable. I don't think physically we'll put something that high resolution in space. So I think that's something dedicated observatories for something like that, I think probably needs to be explored or something.
Okay, so if you don't have any other question, let's thank Brittany again. And I'll see you next week.